perceptions of teenagers was on a steady rise throughout the 1970s because of the introduction of the hippie subculture. And not every single teen was doing hallucinogenic drugs, which was a general aspect of that subculture. The idea of rejecting conventional values and countering mainstream American life remained rampant among youth. And with this rise in rebellion and challenge to authority came a new need for correcting the behavior of teens across America, and this became what is dubbed now as the troubled teen industry, most notably in Utah, which ended up becoming the epicenter for treatment programs like this. But a problem made itself quickly aware, since there was no laws, as this was a completely new industry during the time. Since there was no laws, horrific accounts of abuse continued to make itself more aware. And without the internet at the time, many authorities and families were unaware of the abuses happening within the programs themselves. And Utah ended up becoming the receptacle for troubled teens across the country. So in regards to the stimulus material, reading texts like In Their Own Words and Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, both of those highlight the ignorance of authority abuse and just the blind eye of government when it comes to institutions and aspects of life. And Nelson Mandela said that, why am I here? Mandela said that inmates lost their sense of self within prisons that, quote, are designed to break one's spirit. And then for Haitian survivors, despite being credited as resilient, they didn't receive proper recovery or reconstruction efforts after the tragedies. The criticization of authority didn't end with these cases, and repetition of the issues shows a demand for immediate action. That is why. Coupling government ignorance to survivor accounts and continued use of the schools involved, the state of Utah fails to protect teens from physical and mental abuse and also traumatic experiences. So with such a pivotal impact, how can Utah improve the surveillance of the rehabilitation centers to prevent patients from experiencing psychological and physical abuse within them? Although in some instances these schools have had a successful turnout, Utah has to improve surveillance on these schools by enacting strict policy laws alongside frequent unannounced visits. This is because of repeated accounts of abuse and long-lasting trauma inflicted on teens within the centers. So I'm going to take you through a quick synopsis of what I believe is the most alarming accounts about these schools, and then I'm going to propose my solution. And from there, I hope to convince you of its demand and volume. So, Jennifer Dobner, she is a Utah journalist for the Associated Press for 7 years. She wrote that a network of schools was sued by over 350 former students who said that they were, quote, denied food and medical care, lived in filth, and suffered extreme physical and sexual abuse. The fact that this was a network of schools shows urgency that these inhumane conditions were experienced by a vast majority of students and isn't only limited to one or two bad apples. And it's also important to note that in Utah, abandonment and neglect charges is actually a third-degree felony. And that's one of the most severe charges in the state. And parents who are charged with this can face up to 15 years in prison. And the fact that these facilities are being accused of that very same thing, and worse in some cases, and then they aren't even being accused or charged at all. Even on paper, there's little to no evidence. What's it called? And it's alarming with an influx of media coverage and stories that no action has been taken place to ensure the safety of teens within schools. Salt Lake Tribune author Jessica Miller wrote an entire series of articles about the problem, its history, and future efforts. And in the first article, she talks about the Utah Senate, who in 2021 passed the very first bill to address the use of drugs and restraints within troubled teen rehabilitation facilities. And the senators, they were initially dismissive, saying, quote, the abuses happened long ago, and, quote, kids aren't experiencing the same thing now. Though emails say otherwise, that the abuse is actually systemic. Within abusive facilities, the goal of the abuser is to strip the victim of their individuality, because this makes them more likely to comply and less likely to rebel. And this can be constituted by isolation, confiscation of personal items, things like that. And Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom discusses this, and it says that prison is a microcosm of the outside world. And and it's the same with troubled teen rehabilitation facilities, of that stripping of individuality, everyone's wearing the same thing, XYZ. And the experiences and ideals that Mandela experienced within the prison itself reflects the challenges of the outside world. So there's a gigantic stigma around trauma, in that it only affects the individual in the moment, or it goes away, or it's not as serious as people make it out to seem. But as it's documented in their own words, text about the Haitian earthquake survivors, trauma actually has adverse physiological changes, like the release of stress hormones, and it's poor on health. And with this, PTSD is also common within alumni, as well as suicide. And the trauma and pain not only affects the individual, but it also affects the families. And sometimes kids feel the need to flee from schools, and the fight or flight response demonstrates an active threat and a need to flee. And it also opens up teens to more traumatic experiences. So, possible solutions. One could argue that Utah should shut down all troubled teen schools entirely. But there's no opportunity for good schools to arise, there's no accountability for abusive staff. Or Utah could fire or charge abusive staff. This would hold accountability and may influence other staff to get their act together. But abusers are good at hiding, and there's a nested debate of laws protecting victims. So my solution is policy laws and frequent visits. So for laws, strict and monitored treatment plans can give an exact outline on what to do, but it may bar non-abusive treatment through legal loopholes, and laws are still broken. So ideally, all should be good. All treatment centers should be healthy and non-abusive. And since usually these schools are a last resort, extensive research isn't available to families. Ignorance perpetuates the issue, and it doesn't hinder systemic authority abuse. So Utah holds a major responsibility with an industry so lucrative to the business. And it shouldn't be popularized by abuse and neglect, and it should be an attractive place for treatment, with utilizing their gorgeous landscapes for dynamic wilderness therapy or sleek modern residential halls to curate a safe living space for healing teenagers. So the state has time to turn from an example of what not to do to the treatment epicenter it should have been. Let's get more excited. Yeah.
Okay. Clay, how did your research question evolve as you moved through the research process?
Well, I did start because I do have some preliminary research with this topic. I was initially looking at the Elan School in Maine because I knew that I wanted to talk about abuse within treatment centers, but then I realized that talking about the Elan School, it was only one school, and that wouldn't fully encapsulate and help visualize that this problem is experienced in such a big and vast way. And then I found the article on Provo Canyon that Jessica Miller did. Her entire series was from the Paris Hilton documentary. And then from there, looking into that, I saw that there was actually listed an entire kind of arsenal of schools that I could look at. And then from realizing that Utah had such, I guess, a bad rep with troubled teen rehabilitation facilities, it kind of went from focusing on one school to this is an entire systemic problem. So.
Okay. And what are the implications of your findings to your community?
My community. I think as somebody who's been in the system, my community I would consider also teens who have struggled, also people in the facilities themselves, and having a safe space for people to get the help that they need is so important. Because if you're constantly seeing like something that should be positive and should make you feel better, as if I go into this, I'm going to come out of it with more trauma, it's not exactly great. So I hope that if this were to be enacted, then more teens would feel comfortable reaching out and talking about things and getting the help that they need, and becoming better and healthier people.
Okay. Thank you.
Good job.